Hey, everybody.
Hey, Jack. Thank you, everybody. Before we get started, hey, Jack, good to see you here.
You too, man.
Yeah. This is the first time I think we've ever met in person.
Yeah.
Is at this event. We've been
It
working
really
together
is.
for 3 years, and this is the first time we've ever met. This is
and we had a soaking wet, rain-covered hug.
Yeah.
Really, really touching.
It was fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks to Mike and Lana for putting this event together and inviting us. It's fantastic to be able to talk here. And before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the Ramaytush Ohlone land, unceded land. Okay, so before I get started, a couple weeks ago, I was putting together my slides, and there's a GDC going on this week, in case you didn't know. And they had a bunch of templates put together for the slides, so I'm like, okay, I'm just going to use that template. And there's a bunch of slides I didn't want to use, but there were these two slides, the first two slides of this presentation. I couldn't figure out how to work them into the presentation at all, but I couldn't delete the slides because they were just too cool to have in my presentation. I'm working for Santa Monica Studio, giving my first presentation for Santa Monica Studio on a game that a lot of people say, the finest people say, is Game of the Year. There you go. So these two slides, I didn't know how to work them into the presentation naturally at all, but I didn't want to get rid of them. So this is what I came up with. Let's see if you like it.
I'm excited.
Santa Monica Studio presents a God of War Ragnarok presentation. Okay, so today we are talking about air dragons and the systemic flight system of God of War Ragnarok. My name's Geoff Harrower. I'm a principal gameplay programmer at Santa Monica Studios.
And I'm Jack Ebensteiner, lead character animator at Santa Monica Studios.
Thank you. All right, and before we get deep into this presentation, legal disclaimer, this presentation contains spoilers and also includes mid-production content that did not ship with the final game. All right, so if you're not familiar with God of War Ragnarok or the Air Dragons, I've got a little video here to highlight some of the dragon stuff in the game.
Signal. Bugger's alive.
Not for long if that dragon has its way.
It will not.
Got him cornered.
Focus up!
Brought back some wildlife, but suppose I spoke too soon.
And another round of applause for the dragons. Thank you. All right, so here's what we're going to be talking about in the presentation today. I'm going to start off with the combat behavior of the dragons. Combat is what kind of started this whole initiative of getting a systemic flight system and all the requirements of combat. So I'm going to go over that first. Then I'm going to talk about some math, how we built the path using a Bezier curve, and some interesting techniques there to, I don't know, make that work for video games. And then I'm going to step back and let Jack talk to you about animating flight at a high level for the dragons from an animator's perspective. And then I'll talk about the procedural animation techniques we used to make this systemic flight system kind of come to life. And then talk about some scripted flight path work that we did. Once we had this systemic flight system, we were able to find a bunch of different ways to use it in the game, so I'll talk about that. And then the culmination of all of our work, something we wanted in the game from the beginning, was this dragon pickup moment, so we're going to talk about that a little bit. All right. So let's start with combat. Like I said, this whole thing started off with you need to fight the dragons in a combat arena. So let me talk about what that looks like. So imagine this little X here in the middle of the screen is the player as Kratos, and you're fighting a dragon. So this white circle here is the area, we call this the flight volume. So it's the area that the dragon is not allowed to leave. The reason we have this is just so the dragon doesn't clip into a big environment art that's kind of encapsulating the combat space. So it could be like a big forest or a big mountain or something like that. But this is the area that's safe for the dragon to fly in general. Is not allowed to leave this space. Now this green line here, that's the dragon. The dragon's flying at the player, breathing fire, and the player needs to dodge that fire. So this red circle, this is the attack range. So this was very important to the combat designers that when the dragon is approaching the player and breathing that stream of fire, that they have a consistent distance and time in order to react. So it was predictable and the player could learn the timing of that attack. So the dragon always needs to start its attack run from outside of this red circle. So if you take all that stuff, all those requirements, you end up with something like this, where the dragon will fly at the player, and then continue in a straight line out towards the edge of that range circle, turn around, and come back and attack the player again. And you kind of get this shape. The dragon could turn left or right as they leave this red circle, but either way, they're just turning around and attacking the player, which seems like pretty straightforward behavior. Not too complicated, but there were a bunch of weird edge cases that we ran into that I'm going to talk about that make this a pretty challenging problem. So the first one is, what if the player moves close to the edge of the flight volume, the area where the dragon is not allowed to leave? So if you were close but not too close, so close enough that this turn circle would intersect with the flight volume, what I ended up doing is bailing out early and starting to turn towards the flight volume. So what I would do, here, let me bring up a laser pointer. So we would continue the flight path in a straight line up to the flight volume and then walk along the flight volume along the perimeter until we got to a point where the turn rate of the dragon wasn't too high. So it was within metrics for what the dragon would do. And then we would connect that path together to get this nice long curving arc path for the dragon to get to the perimeter. There were other edge cases very similar to this, where the range circle could actually be outside the flight volume itself. So in that case, what we would do is take the turn circle here that the dragon would normally take once it leaves the red circle and walk it backwards until it intersected, it was tangent to the flight volume. So you get a path kind of like this. And again, you'd be at the perimeter of the flight volume, right? So there were some problems with some of these levels. A lot of the levels were built before we had the opportunity to build this flight system, and there were these sometimes big trees, big spiky kind of mountain things. The tower in the crater was a big thing that was right in the middle of the flight volume. So we had to deal with these things that I called obstacles. So what we would do is author these purple circles in our level editor that represented obstacles that the dragon had to avoid while it was flying. So if you were running your regular flight path here, and you went to turn and come back and attack the player, and the path that you were going to take intersected one of these obstacles, we would basically push this straight line path all the way again until the turn circle became tangent to the flight volume, and again, you'd be safe at the perimeter of the flight volume. We had this rule that if the dragon could get to the perimeter of the flight volume, then it was safe for it to fly all the way around the space without intersecting anything. So that gave us the ability to fly behind these obstacles. And it had this nice effect of, it looked really cool. When the dragon flew behind something, it just looked really nice. So that kind of worked out. So we get to the perimeter of the flight volume. And then basically what would happen is we'd construct another one of these turn circles here based on the rate of turn of the dragon, and align it so that it aimed at the player and they would fly straight at the player and do the attack, which is all pretty straightforward there. But again, that turn circle could intersect with an obstacle. So what we ended up doing was detecting if the flight path intersected with that obstacle, and then continue walking around the perimeter constantly shooting this line at the player until you didn't intersect with any obstacles. And in this case, you would just kind of step. I was doing, I think, at like 5-degree increments around the perimeter of the flight volume. You'd probably step like 10 times here until you got out. But some of the levels, in particular the beach level that had this big bridge right through the middle of the volume and lots of mountains and stuff on the other side, ended up having to walk like almost the full way around the circle before you could find an entry path. But it ended up working pretty well, that technique. And then we had another problem where some of these obstacles were within the playable space, so the player could walk into an obstacle. This was a particular problem, again, in the crater where the player could put their back right up against the tower, and there was no way for the dragon to fly overhead in that case. They had to get out of the way of that tower early. So what we ended up doing is at the point where the player would cross, the dragon would cross the player's path, construct 2 of these turn circles, and then if those intersected with any obstacles or the player was inside an obstacle, we'd walk backwards along this flight path until one of these 2 circles no longer intersected with an obstacle, and then the dragon would take that path instead. And what that meant was the dragon had to start veering away from the player before it got to the player, but it meant that it didn't have to fly through any of these obstacles. And the way we handled that from a combat perspective is the dragon could aim their fire breath up at the player. So instead of flying overhead and shooting them down, it would actually bank up the fire and shoot them at more of a horizontal angle and then veer off to avoid the obstacle. So it kind of punished the player a little bit for hiding inside obstacles, which was nice. So it ended up looking like this. So you'd come around the perimeter, find a clean entry path, and then veer off to avoid the obstacle and fly straight towards the edge of the flight volume again. And that worked really well. Now that you kind of understand the problems we were trying to solve with creating the path, we had to realize that path somehow, and the technique that we used was Bezier curves. Room full of animators, I'm sure you're all familiar with Bezier curves, but these are the control points of the Bezier curve, and if you want to use this for a flight path, you need to walk along that curve at a consistent speed. Because the dragon's flying at a consistent speed, you need to walk that path at a consistent speed. So you're going to need to know the arc length of the Bezier curve. So the way to solve that is if you look at these lines, so these 3 lines here that are constructed by connecting the control points, and this line here, which is constructed by connecting the start point and the end point, we know that the arc length of the curve is somewhere in between the length of these lines and the length of this line. And so what we can do is subdivide this curve into multiple Bezier curves until the difference between this length and this length is within some error tolerance, and then we know that we've roughly got the arc length of the curve. Credit to Tim Romero for coming up with that. And then this is a screenshot of what the Bezier curve looked like in-game. I don't know how well this comes across in the video, but there's these little purple circles here. Those are the points where the curve has been segmented. And you can see there's a lot higher density of that in the curved sections of the flight path than in the straight line sections of the flight path. So now, once we've done all this subdivision, you can kind of think of a section of that curve as roughly being a straight line. So we'll talk about it as if it is a straight line. So we know the length of that line. That's pretty straightforward. And we have a desired distance that we want to travel in one frame in order to maintain a consistent speed. So you'd think, first thing you try is, okay, take the t parameter that you evaluate the Bezier curve with and calculate it by taking your desired distance and divide it by the full length of that segment and see if that works. And it kind of works, but not really. It was good enough to kind of get things going and start testing this stuff, but the dragon would move at these really weird kind of speeds. It was kind of right, but mostly not. And then there were some really bad edge cases where it would just like warp almost the entire distance of the curve. So we had to find a way to fix that. So again, this was all Tim Romero who came up with this algorithm. But you can basically take the t value and compare it to the actual distance we get if we evaluate that segment using the t value. And then you can divide those 2 numbers and you get an error ratio. And then you can use that error ratio to calculate a new t value, t equals t over error ratio. And then you can continue doing that in a loop until your error ratio gets low enough to a desired tolerance again. And in practice for us with the flight volumes, I had a cap of 10 iterations on that, but usually it would be 2 or 3 before it would converge. So it wasn't too expensive. And we were able to cache all of these subdivisions of the curve and everything for multiple calculations in a frame. So it worked. It was great. gave us what we needed for this consistent speed. So this is an overhead view of the dragon flying around using this combat behavior. And what you're seeing here is the algorithm that I described earlier updating in real time and the splines being recalculated. So it's important to note here that as the player's moving around, this flight path had to update in real time and track 100% that player so that if the player didn't dodge, the dragon was going to hit them. So you'll see that the curve is updating continuously, redoing all these calculations. But sometimes if the player moved just a little bit, it would throw everything kind of out of whack, and it would take like a completely different path around the flight volume. So there are a whole bunch of like refinements here to lock in certain things that weren't allowed to change. And then once the dragon got close enough to the player, we forget about obstacles, forget about everything, and you're just locked into this path, except for the stuff that came at the end of the path. But this is what it looked like. It's kind of cool to watch it. But this is what it looked like in-game initially, with no real procedural animation techniques applied. We got a path doing what we want it to do, but it doesn't look good at all. So there's still a fair bit of work here to get this thing looking realistic. And with that, I'll take a step back and let Jack talk about how he approached animating the dragons.
Hey, everybody. So yeah, to add to all that, getting this to feel good was hugely important because it's critical to the fantasy of fighting the dragon. When it's flying, that's when the player has to respect the dragon. Like you can pummel it all over on the ground, but the air is its domain, and at that point, it's dictating the terms of the fight. And the variable time between attack runs, due to the generated pathing, actually became a big add to the fantasy of fighting a flying dragon, because it meant that the player couldn't get into a wholly predictable rhythm. It keeps people acting a little bit more like they would with a dragon flying around. Eyes to the sky, searching around, darting back and forth, like, oh, where'd it go? And spotting it just as the next sweep is coming. So, good work, Geoff.
Thanks, Jack.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the animation involved to help realize this whole thing. This will just be a brief overview. We're not deep diving today. Obviously, Geoff was doing sorcery, and I was making cartoons. Thank you, thank you. So I'm going to keep this pretty short. We're really going to fly through this thing. And just a reminder for some context, I'm just the sidecar to Geoff's motorcycle for this discussion. So I'm going to start at the start, briefly talk about how I began with the dragons, and specifically with flight. Then I'll touch on some high-level mechanical thoughts. Not a tutorial, there's plenty of those out there, but just some things that I was thinking about when I was getting started. Some basic control additions to a rig and the resulting blockout process that made animating flight a lot easier. Some clips of the animations in isolation and the huge value of your pose and clip library. And I will end by showing some results in a few canned animations that we call gameplay moments, or GPMs. So I'm going to bring our friend back just for a moment for a little added context. So I basically begged for the dragons. I never really had much chance to do a lot of creature work on a game before, and I was really, really stoked about them. Our studio's creatures are one of the main reasons that I joined Santa Monica in the first place, so finally getting the opportunity, I didn't want to mess it up. I knew the intent was to build some sort of flight system for the dragons, to have some one-off cinematic dragony moments. And I'd never animated flight before. It's no problem.
I find that hard to believe.
So to the lab I went, and by that I mean that one Brendan Body blog post on bird flight, and a bottomless pit of reference on YouTube and the BBC Motion Gallery. So it turns out that it's really hard, and there is a ton to digest. So while I was getting acquainted with that, I began by doing a series of tests to feel out what descriptors and animal influences felt right that might impact how the dragon flies. I like to do this kind of thing with characters that are a little less defined at their inception. So here's a sample of those. This one is based on just the word serpentine, taking inspiration from that. Others here inspired by qualities of a barn owl, looking at how the body flows, how agile they are on their feet versus their wings. Do they climb? Just trying some of those things on. And if anyone's curious why the dragon suddenly looks different, these are animated on a dragon from God of War 2018, just with the arms folded into its chest. So just a good example of getting by with what you have. So flight is extremely mechanical. But there is a lot of stylistic variety to play with. As I grew more comfortable with flight, I felt it was honestly a lot like a walk cycle. Just like a walk cycle, regardless of the character, there are a handful of shared body mechanics, and the key differences between them are in timing and intensity. So for flight, there's a pool of them consistent across virtually all flying animals. Your birds, your bats, everything except, maybe insects, flying squirrels, gliding lizards, all of that. Given all that, it was critical to study the reference and get an understanding of what those tunable shared elements are. So some examples, what's the range of motion for the wings in a standard flap versus heavy exertion or something more akin to just keep alive during a glide? What are the up-down flap ratios? Is the downstroke twice as long as the upstroke, or are they about equal? How do the main masses, the head, chest, hips, contribute to the flap action, and how flexible versus stiff is that motion as it runs through the body? Which mass looks like it's really driving that action? Additionally, how frequently do flaps happen? Is it mostly gliding with the occasional corrective, or do they happen near constantly? Or the amount of bend or shape change in the wing throughout the flap, like does it hug the body tightly on the up, or does it just gently bend? How much do the wingtips drag? So birds and bats have so many different looks to their flight, all by dialing in those kinds of shared mechanics. Those are the primary tools to help define your style and feel. So before we got started really digging into flight, we had to understand the best control setup so that we wouldn't be counter-animating or trying to untangle the body mechanics from the dragon's movement through space. There's nothing groundbreaking here, but separating out the rotates and global and local translates really unlocked flight animation for me. I often work in a layered way, so breaking those things apart already made sense if you're not used to working that way. Doing so may take a little bit of mental remapping, but it's hugely useful with the kinds of curves that you're often pushing around in flight. So essentially all we did was add 3 controls on top of the rig. This top control here manages the world translations along a flight path as well as the yaw rotations. One below that is where you keep the local translations, like your smaller up-down with each flap, as well as the roll rotations. And finally, a third control below that for pitch, plus any smaller translate or rotate corrections during polish. So now doing the thing. First things first, started with tests, dozens and dozens of tests. Flap and glide cycles. Excuse me here. So I'll show a couple in a minute. Some of the super early stuff is so bad, it'd be irresponsible to let you all see that. So I'll just show a couple examples. Flap and glide, as well as sending them down different splines to get a feel for moving the dragon through space. To help dial in the look, I also made a generic flap cycle and set up a series of animation layers that allowed me to amp up or quiet down different elements of it. So lots of experimenting later, once I had an overall look that I liked. I animated it for real, which is what you're seeing here, along with a core glide cycle. I made enters and exits to transition them, and along with Geoff's procedural genius, we did quite a bit with just those pieces. We did need tighter turn coverage, so I also created this drift turn that skids sideways and kind of whips the legs and tail out, which I think turned out pretty fun. And looking at the game, you can actually tell which anims were done earlier and which came later. You can kind of see the different eras, even in this video here. The first ones, the wings are like big tarps. They're totally boneless wings. And it turns out bone and wings are better. The body was also a totally wet noodle, just dragging behind and overlapping, no real thought to the muscles involved. And with some practice and rubbing some more reference on it, I gradually added more structure and tension. The final look was ultimately really influenced by macaws, actually. The kind of wing shapes that they get with their super broad feathers, lots of straights against curves, their landing and takeoff behavior from vertical surfaces like a tree trunk. And I found the frequency of flap versus glide to feel about right. So to actually use a lot of these in the system that Geoff built, which he'll be able to detail further in a minute, I had to do some additional blend variations of all of those component anims. Sometimes with some wonky and sometimes real sassy poses layered in. They were tuned to work in tandem with the procedural adjustments, blending up and down as needed, shaping the body and tail to curve with the turn. So, the library. From the animations that I'd done so far, I clipped out flap cycles at varying intensities, glides with more or less wind affecting the wings, hover cycle, and I saved off a bunch of poses for the wings with them spread wide, closed tight, and key points throughout the upstroke and the downstroke. So using just those base building blocks, the process kind of looked like drawing out a motion path and sliding the top control along it. Then I would build in the yaw so it kind of has car steering. After that, I would do a roll pass to match. And then beyond that, adding pitch for any translate Y in the spline. And then I just started pasting in flaps. With fully polished flap and glide cycles, it was super easy to squash and stretch keys to add variation in timing and energy. And honestly, I could have a reasonably solid custom flight sequence in an hour or two. There's still plenty more to do after that, adjusting poses for the shape of the spline, adding any behavior on top of that, like roaring, breathing fire. But most of it is there, and the physics are all working and making sense. So I'll cap this off with a few examples of some gameplay moments that served as intros for the dragons or some flavor that I created heavily using the library. Hopefully this doesn't blow out the speakers. Just as the music was getting good. Thank you. So before I hand the con back to Geoff, I have to give a shout out to the Sophie Evans of Hot Seat fame, who drove the first stages of Previous for the Dragons with some truly sick work. It was a huge inspiration for me, so thank you to her for kicking us off right. And there's a lot more to talk about in regard to creating the dragons. There's combat, ambient behaviors, inspirations, realities of production, technical and gameplay considerations. So if you want to know more, if you have questions, find me on Twitter or something. I'm happy to talk some details. Back to you.
All right, so with everything Jack showed you, that's kind of the visual target for what we want to see while the Dragon is in the systemic flight system. And just as a reminder, this is where we are right now, very far away from what he showed. Right, so what did we do to fix this? So we start with the basic pose that came from either a basic glide or flap looping animation. And then we would add pitch. And sounds very similar to what Jack was doing with his rig in Maya. So we would add pitch, which would basically conform the pitch of the dragon to the tangent of the Bezier curve. And then we would add roll, which was basically just rotating the dragon around its forward vector based on a damped turn rate as calculated through the flight path. And then we would add head aim. So the dragon was always looking at a point on its path at some point in the future based on time. So it kind of had some awareness of where it was trying to go. And then these blend drivers. So every flap loop, glide loop, or transition, Jack would have to make 3 versions of those. One for going in a straight line, one for banking left, or one for banking right. So even though the roll was being done procedurally, there's still differences in the way you want the animation to look when it is rolled. So Jack would have to kind of animate that and then take out the roll, and then I would put it back on, basically. And then, as Jack mentioned, drift. I never would have thought of adding drift to the dragons, but Jack was quite insistent on it, and it really adds a lot, and you'll see later in some of the scripted moments, it really, really shines. So the drift was basically disconnecting the facing of the dragon from the movement direction, and we had a bunch of tunable variables that you could kind of procedurally kind of dial in what kind of drift you wanted. And then, again, Jack would have to animate that drift animation, but then take out all the stuff that actually made it a drift, and then we would reapply it again at runtime. I don't know how he did that, to be honest. And then, as Jack mentioned, I forgot to put it in the slide, we also had a vertical offset from the Bezier curve, similar to his setup in Maya as well. And then we also had a procedural head aim system built for this. And this ended up being the starting point for our more general purpose dragon head tracking system that ultimately became the quadruped head tracking system in the game. Relatively straightforward approach here, just picking a joint chain along the neck and then aiming each joint along the chain at the target with varying degrees of damping and like percentage of that, and you end up getting something really nice for the head tracking. And as you can see here, we also had control over where exactly within the mouth the fire was shooting, so we could dial in something that looked good there. But this was critical for combat because the dragon needed to be able to aim the fire at the player, maintain a consistent angle towards the ground so that the player could predict when the fire was coming and all that kind of stuff. And with all that, this is what it ended up looking like in the final product, with the splines shown. You see it flew around that tree because there's an obstacle for that tree. There's one point where it slides around the tower. We're pretty happy with the way this ended up looking in the final product. I think it's, for something that's updating live in gameplay with all these procedural effects, it looks not as good as something Jack scripted, but pretty close. Okay, that's good. All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is our scripted flight path. So basically what happened here is we got combat working, it looked really good, and then people started asking, well, could you do this and do that? And the first thing that they wanted to do was have the dragon fly from perch to perch in the crater. So I don't know if you played the game, but the first time I played the crater, I was really annoyed at the dragon flying perch to perch and attacking me while I was trying to fight some other boss, and I regretted building this thing because it was super annoying. But it was fun to build. So the problem basically breaks down like this. You've got the dragon at a current position and heading and velocity, and you want it to get to a target position, heading and velocity. So these are known in advance. These are just like static points in the world that you want the dragon to start at and end at. So sitting on a perch here, you want him to just fly over to this perch facing this direction, and then it will play these nice canned landing animations when you get to the perch. So how do we solve that? So again, we know the turning radius of the dragons, so we can put these circles down here that represent how all the different ways that the dragon could enter into this trajectory, right? And then what we do is find something called the external shared tangents of those circles, which is basically what you're seeing here. It's the lines that connect the circles on either side, but they don't cross, basically. And then there's always 2 between any 2 circles unless they're intersecting, and that's just another edge case to deal with. But this is basically what it looks like here. And then you throw out all the ones that would travel in the wrong direction. So you can see here the dragon's flying in this direction, so this line here, perfectly good. This one here doesn't make any sense. So we toss that one out and keep this one. And then you do the shared external tangents between these 2 circles, and none of those work. You can see because it would end up going the wrong direction when it gets to this circle. This one, you can't start going backwards, so these ones both get thrown out. And then you do the same thing between these 2 circles. Those are both bad as well, and these 2 circles, and you keep that one. And what you end up at the end of this is these 2 potential flight paths that follow the external shared tangents. And then you do the exact same thing for what's called internal shared tangents, which are where the lines cross. And you go find the 2, toss out any that don't work, so on and so forth. And at the end, you have these 4 potential flight paths. So there's 2 that kind of go along here and pretty much straight to the point, and then these 2 kind of loop around this way and come back to roughly that same point, one of them taking a big long loop along this way. So what we do at that point is analyze all those paths and just take the shortest one, and that's the one that the dragon's going to take, and it ends up looking like this. And this is what that ends up looking like in the final product. One more. There we go. So dragon takes off in a canned animation. It solves the path, comes in for a landing. Looked really nice. So the dragon would do this all throughout the crater, just flying from perch to perch and pestering you. So this was a bit of a pain in the ass, though. So I started building the system, maybe a year and a bit before we shipped, and this lightning bolt was not there at that time, and no one told me there was going to be a lightning bolt. But apparently that lightning bolt was really important. And I understand after playing the game why it's important, but I was like, how is this lightning bolt so important that you can't move it like 10 feet to the right or to the left? But apparently they could not move this lightning bolt. So now we had to deal with obstacles in these flight paths, because for whatever reason, they stuck the lightning bolt right in the middle of the flight path for where the dragon's attacking you when you first enter the crater, so they would fly right through the lightning bolt every single time. So there wasn't a whole lot of time, because no one told me this until, a couple months before we were ready to ship. I don't know. But fortunately, found a pretty quick and dirty way of solving this problem. So flight path intersects with the obstacle, no good. So what I ended up doing was constructing 2 more turn circles that were of a much larger turn radius, and then running the exact same algorithm on those and coming up with a second candidate flight path. And I would basically throw out any flight paths from the original or these larger ones that would intersect with the obstacle. So sometimes that meant the dragon would end up taking the long way around these circles to avoid the obstacles. Sometimes it just meant the dragon would take a wide turn radius as it left the perch and a short turn radius as it entered the perch. But most of the time, the results just looked pretty natural. So this worked, and because all of this stuff was static in the environment, didn't change at runtime, as long as we tested all these combinations, we knew it was going to work. And this solution ended up being good enough. It's not terribly robust in the general sense, but it worked for all the cases that we had obstacles in these scripted flight paths. Lots of ways we could probably improve this in the future, but this was enough. So then the next thing was okay, so we've got this scripted flight path for going from perch to perch. Could we use that to create these really cool dragon moments in the game? And there were a whole bunch that our designers had come up with that they wanted, but Jack was too busy animating Garm, and I can't believe you also animated Garm on top of the dragons. That's a crazy amount of animation work. Yeah. But Jack did not have enough time to create these scripted animations for all these things that they wanted. So we tried out the scripted flight path, and basically by connecting all these solves, you could get some pretty interesting flight paths using the systemic system. Not a lot of changes to the procedural animation or the drift or when it flapped or when it would glide. All the logic that kind of informed that stuff stayed consistent through all of this and worked really well. So we added something where in the level editor you could author these waypoints with directions, and then just set the dragon off. And then in scripting, you turn on and off the fire breath for the dragon, so the dragon could breathe fire through these things. And we ended up some really, really cool sequences, so I'll show you some of those right now. This one is probably my favorite. This is the second dragon moment in the final Ragnarok battle in the game. And the reason I love it so much is because we were able to really showcase that drift from a really cool angle, and I just love the way this one turned out.
Incoming!
What's our next plan, brother?
We have no other plan. Our focus remains on the war machines.
We should head for the flaw behind the Asgard.
And then the other
Without Ragnarok,
interesting
it's
thing
our
here is
only
if we
chance to
scripted
break
this,
through
you
the-
need to do something with the dragon when this moment is over. But because we were using a systemic system, we were able to just like delete some of the early waypoints, connect the later waypoints back to themselves, and have the dragon just fly in this interesting loop off in the background, and not have to like have the dragon fly behind something in order to disappear or something, which really added a lot to the possibilities that we could have the dragon do, because it was really hard to hide the dragon once it flew by in a like general sense, but having it just kind of circle up in the air looked really cool and added a lot. In that roughly the same moment in the game, I was able to add a dragon flyby while you were in combat, so the dragon would just fly along this scripted path and just shoot fire, and you'd have to see it coming and dodge out of the way. That was pretty cool. It just added, we were trying to get Ragnarok to feel alive, like a lot of stuff happening, so just throwing some random dragon moments in here was fun. This one was pretty cool too. The dragon just comes down and shoots fire at random things for unknown reasons. And then I was just having too much fun with this, so I just threw more fire off in the background, made him tank, and against the sky. It just looked fantastic. I was having too much fun with this. Thank you. And this one was like, so I talked about the dragon pickup. We wanted the dragon to be able to pick up the player, just as a really cool thing to have happen. And then our lead encounter designer, Andrew Chrysophides, came up with this interesting story for one of the dragons, that this dragon would be the grabby dragon. And as you're walking up to the, what is this one, the Vanaheim jungle, you'd spot the dragon pick up this deer and carry it off to its lair. And then when you were fighting the dragon would be all grabby and just constantly grabbing you and flying up and grabbing you. And that's where we would showcase the dragon pickup. So this was the first time we tried to get a synchronized animation working with the systemic flight path to kind of test out this pickup thing. So this is the dragon picking up the deer.
Suppose I spoke too soon.
So that was a nice little taste of what it would be like to pick something up, but we wanted to get the player in there too. And this was one of those things that like just seemed like a really good idea, but every step of the way there was something stopping it from happening. And we really wanted this to happen. But like, holy smokes. Like, I couldn't believe how many things were preventing it from like being shippable, like shipping quality.
Yeah, Geoff really willed this into existence. He kind of snuck it into an all-hands meeting. We were getting a team update on Friday and just tacked the sound at the end. And if it's in that meeting, it's like legally binding. Like, you have to ship with that. So.
Yeah, and like every time we ran into a problem, I was like, there's no way this is going to happen. This is going to get cut. And credit to the designers and leadership, like they stuck with it, and we plowed through every single problem. And this was the end result here. So the dragon picks up Kratos, and now everything that Kratos is doing here under player control is layered onto the bottom part of the dragon's body. So so that we could play these synchronized animations without interrupting the dragon flap animations that were happening, because that was really important. Otherwise, it was going to look really janky with the dragon's wings just constantly jittering to synchronize with the player animation. So that's, it was like 3 seconds of gameplay or something, but like, I'm so happy that this made it into the game.
And a quick animation note on that. We shot mocap for it. I thought I was totally prepared. I came with previs, I came with poses, but we had to throw all the data away. And not for any fault from our actor. He was phenomenal, gave like a lot of energy. I just was not prepared well enough for it. And so even after working the data for quite a while, the main note that I got was that Kratos looked like an old man stuck in a beanbag chair. So ultimately, I had to hanky the whole thing.
As you do.
As you do.
All right, so that's everything. Special thanks, obviously, to Jack. His animations were fantastic. I can't believe he hand-keyed all this stuff. It looks so realistic to me. Absolutely blown away with his skills. Eitan Weisenberg was the combat designer who brought the dragons to life. He did all the combat on the ground and a lot of the scripting while the dragon was in flight, and he did a bang-up job there. Didn't realize how much fun they were until I played the game after it was released. And then Ender Crucifidus, finding ways to integrate the dragons into as many places and in many encounters and levels as possible. I really appreciated the freedom he gave me to try out things and see where we could fit. And like something as big as the dragons, there's so many people at the studio that contributed to this stuff that I can't list them all here, from audio to rendering to effects and everything. So thank you to everyone who worked on these. It was a lot of fun. And it's GDC week. We've got a whole bunch of Santa Monica studio talks lined up for GDC. I think the animation ones have already happened, but look at all these great talks coming up over the next few days. Goksu's here today. She's doing an AI talk. Solar is here. He's doing a traversal talk. We got Sam Sternklar here doing a visual scripting talk. Lots of really cool stuff. And of course, might as well keep this slide in here. We're hiring. So if you're looking for a job, I don't know what kind of jobs we have, but they're out there. And that's it. That's all we got. Thank you.
Thank you.